We all have things in our past that we'd like to keep there. Places we used to live, seasons we barely survived, versions of ourselves we worked very hard to outgrow, stories we find ourselves continually trying to outrun. Maybe today you're a successful leader. You're building a business, leading an organization, and curating an impressive reputation. But if you're like me, you're sitting somewhere in the second half of your career. Decades of accomplishments stand behind you. But instead of only looking forward to the next win, you're starting to look back. Not just at what we built and overcome, but at the stories we thought we forgotten about. Or worse, the ones we can't seem to forget. The ones we've been trying to outrun for decades. That's when different questions start creeping in. Questions about purpose, stewardship, and what this next season is actually asking of us. These questions feel different because they're not asking for more hustle or more building. They're asking us to pay attention to a time we thought was long behind us. A time where we chose a different path than others expected. A moment where we swore we would never become that way. Or a situation we vowed we would never allow ourselves to be in again. And now, we find ourselves asking questions like, where in the world is this coming from? Why am I thinking about this now? Welcome to Craft of Clarity, where we distill the tension between what we built and what we're built for. I'm Steve Muscato. We all carry these stories, the memories from our lives before we became established leaders. They tend to sit in the before column of our biographies, before we built our businesses, before we launched our careers, before we made a name for ourselves. And when we evaluate where we are today, we tend to use those early stories as our primary anchor point. We measure our success by the distance that we place between where we started and where we stand right now. The greater that distance, the more successful we feel. I think about a leader I spent time with recently. He grew up in a home where money was always tight. Every single month brought a quiet, suffocating crisis around the kitchen table over basic bills. Early on, watching his parents stress, he made an unspoken decision. I will work hard enough that security will never be an issue again. That decision drives him to this day. It built a thriving enterprise, established financial independence, and protected his family. Or consider another leader who grew up in an environment where her voice was routinely ignored. Decisions were made about her, but never with her. She turned that quiet frustration into a relentless drive to build organizational cultures where people feel heard, valued, and empowered. Or another story I heard just this past week about a leader whose family-owned business that felt like a predetermined track. Everyone just assumed that she would take it over. All of these stories have something in common. The conditions these leaders lived through became the very catalysts for how they lead today. Those early conditions became part of their identity. They shaped who they are, how they operate, and what they value, and how they protect their people. Those narratives served us well. They helped us build real success. They also place a significant distance between where we started and where we are today. The trap is assuming that because the story's in the past, everything from that season stayed there too. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about the difference between our biographies and our stories. Biographies contain the hard facts. We didn't have money. I had a tough boss. I was surrounded by an environment I didn't choose. Those are the facts. But inside the story, behind those facts, something much deeper was taking place. Formation. That formation is what today's conversation is really about. Without even realizing it, while we were living in those difficult seasons, we were absorbing nuances and instincts that other people completely miss. The leader who grew up without money didn't just learn fear. He learned how to spot operational waste and cash flow friction with incredible precision. He can look at a complex balance sheet in 5 seconds and spot a problem that takes an outside consultant 5 weeks to find. The leader who was overlooked didn't just carry a wound. She developed an acute radar for human potential in the quietest people in the room. She notices who isn't speaking in a meeting and knows exactly how to draw them out safely. And the person who grew up around an industry they wanted to escape, well, they spent years absorbing the conversations, the unwritten rules, the pain points, and the deep human realities of a world most people don't even understand. We don't always choose those inputs. We just lived there long enough for them to imprint on us. Then, when we went to build our careers, we added decades of new inputs to the mix. Boardroom decisions, P&L responsibilities, major wins, costly mistakes, key relationships, and accumulated wisdom. Which brings us to how a distiller looks at inputs. You don't have to know anything about whiskey to understand how time can change an ingredient. When a spirit comes off of a copper still on day one, it doesn't have much depth. It's sharp, it's clear, and it's aggressive. It has a high alcohol proof, but very little character. It's raw power without any nuance. To become something special, it requires time inside the barrel. Inside a quiet rickhouse, that spirit sits inside a charred oak barrel through hot summers and freezing winters. And as the seasons shift, the liquid expands deep into the grain of the wood and draws back out. Over years, time softens those sharp edges. It extracts depth, rich color, and a complexity that couldn't possibly exist on day one. The exact same thing happens to us, especially if you're a leader sitting in the second half of your life. An experience or an environment from 30 years ago doesn't mean the same thing today as it did when we were 20. We're not that 20-year-old anymore. We've had time in the barrel. We have evidence now. So when an old topic or an unexpected pull starts tugging at our sleeves in this season, it can feel confusing. We're trying to evaluate a mature, refined signal using an old, unrefined lens. To see how raw inputs transform over time, I want to take you inside a small distillery in rural Indiana. Jason Fruits grew up in Newtown, Indiana, a tiny agricultural community surrounded by fields where his grandfather ran a local grain elevator. Jason spent his childhood immersed in the world of corn, soil, farming, and the family enterprise. He was fully expected to step into that business, and he wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. He has said openly that as a young man, he couldn't get out of Newtown fast enough. He went off to Purdue University, aimed for engineering, and eventually built a high-level corporate career in finance and management. Jason didn't leave Newtown, hit a wall, fail in business, drag himself back home because he ran out of options. He built a great, successful life away from the rural agriculture he couldn't wait to escape. He thought he had outran that story for good. But even before Jason decided he wanted to get away, his environment had been quietly forming him. He knew grain. He understood farming economics. He watched how small-town relationship worked over coffee in the morning. He absorbed lessons about work ethic, sacrifice, and community simply by breathing the air there for 2 decades. Years later, after adding decades of business and finance and corporate leadership experience, his family began having conversations about ways to diversify the farm. The idea of crafting small batch whiskey had emerged. Suddenly, those old inputs and experiences weren't something to run from or to be embarrassed about. They became valuable assets. He brought his corporate discipline strategy, the financial experience, back to the raw materials of his youth. Today, Jason operates Old 55 Distillery in Newtown, crafting world-class whiskey using corn grown right on his family farm. And when people ask him about building a distillery in a tiny Indiana town, he calls their location their superpower. The very place he wanted to leave became his greatest competitive advantage. His story isn't about escaping the family business. It's about how time, experience, and the seasons in the barrel changed what those original inputs could produce. A master distiller doesn't simply create whiskey. They spend a considerable amount of their time managing inputs: grain, water, yeast, copper, wood, and time. They don't ignore certain ingredients. And they don't just dump every raw material into a barrel and hope for the best. Their primary craft is to notice, to separate what belongs in the final spirit from what needs to be cut away during the distillation run. When a leader finds themselves in the tension between what they've built and what they're built for, they tend to feel a pull toward something different. A new problem, a different community, or a new expression of their work. When this happens, our default instinct is often urgency or even frustration. Why am I thinking about this now? Am I losing my edge? Does this mean I'm supposed to walk away from everything I've built? This is where a master distiller can teach us something valuable. Our stories from the past don't just resurface to disrupt our current season. Like whiskey in the barrel, those inputs have been interacting with the conditions of our life and our leadership for years. They've been aging alongside every success, failure, responsibility, and perspective that we've added along the way. They've been forming and deepening our character, even if we haven't thought about these stories for decades. And when something in our current season starts to get our attention, it can feel like a pull out of the blue. Something we thought we outran becomes something we can't stop thinking about. That's why Jason ended up coming back to the family farm. Not to step into the story in exactly the same place he left it, but to take those inputs, the conversations, the skills, the business acumen, and the sense of community, and apply them to his current season. That's why the leader I spoke to is so committed to building a culture that is supportive and inclusive. And that's why when we distill the tension between what we built and what we're built for, we often find that our past gives our current pull context. If we act like a master distiller, we can view those stories not as situations to outrun, or to forget, or to ignore, but as evidence to examine. We can see what parts of the story need to be left behind and what parts still belong in the season we're in now. This all sounds easy on paper, doesn't it? We just look at our stories in a new light and move forward. But as leaders, we're not built that way, especially when we've spent decades believing some of those stories were long behind us. We default to execution. We see a new input and feel compelled to immediately define, strategize, and execute. We want to figure out what to do with the input, maximize its impact, and move on to the next goal. But when we're looking at the things that formed who we are, how we think, how we operate, and what's attached to our core identity, we're entering unfamiliar territory. A master distiller is not a master because they're fast or because they can maximize inputs on an assembly line. They're a master distiller because they understand the subtle effect of every input on the final outcome. They know which parts are vital and which parts must be cut away so that the legacy of the spirit remains authentic. Taking time to notice, observe, and steward the process is quite literally the opposite of outrunning the story. It's honoring the inputs, tending to the distillation to reveal what's true, and allowing the formation to happen naturally. If you've ever gone to a whiskey tasting, you learn the stories around the inputs that went into what you're tasting. You hear about the years of formation in the barrel and the exact conditions needed to fill the glass that you're holding. Here are my tasting notes for today. First, what's part of your story that you've spent years trying to outrun? It doesn't have to be a painful childhood memory. It could simply be a place, an identity, an expectation, or a version of your life you decided wasn't going to be part of your future. 2. What did that season give you that you may not have recognized at the time? What did you learn, absorb, or become sensitive to? How did it shape the decisions you made, the leader you became, and what you eventually built? How does it show up in your leadership today? And 3, why might that part of your story be getting your attention right now? As success and comfort make room for different questions about your work, your leadership, or your legacy, what are you noticing that connects back to an earlier story? We started today talking about how we built our careers to be different from what our early stories might have suggested. But now, new questions are surfacing. And you might be sensing that those questions are directly connected to a story you forgot or a story you wanted to outrun. If we look at those stories less as a rigid life direction and more of as a raw input that has spent decades interacting with our experience, success, relationships, and leadership, the narrative changes. Those stories stop feeling like ghosts from the past and start helping us understand why a particular pull matters to us now. A master distiller doesn't ignore the inputs. They work with them. They know that what comes out of the still depends on asking and answering different questions, tending to the conditions, and letting the interaction of time, experience, and the barrel do its work. Now that your stories have had a time to form, season after season, it might be time to revisit a few of them. Notice, distill, and let it become another input into the work you are built to do next. If this episode has you thinking about a story from your own past, or asking a different question about the season you're in now, come to the tasting room at craftedclarity.net. And if you're not even sure what you're looking for yet, start with Distill. It's our free tool where you can start with a question you're carrying and see where it takes you. You can find that and everything else in the tasting room at craftedclarity.net. Thanks for joining me today. And remember, clarity isn't found. It's crafted. If today's conversation resonated with you, don't let it end here. Visit craftedclarity.net to explore more conversations, reflections, and resources designed to help you distill the tension between what you've built and what you're built for. You can explore the Still, a curated experience that helps you find the right conversation for the season you're in, learn more about leadership experiences and facilitation through the work of the Distiller, or connect with me directly for a one-on-one conversation. Whatever you're navigating, you don't have to distill it alone. And remember, clarity isn't found, it's crafted.